It began with a routine inventory review inside a rarely discussed royal archive room. Nothing seemed unusual, until Prince Edward noticed that several priceless family heirlooms no longer matched official records. What appeared to be a clerical mistake quickly escalated into something far more alarming. Within hours, palace corridors were buzzing with whispers, and one name kept surfacing behind closed doors: Camilla. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, nobody wanted to believe that anything was wrong. The royal archives had long been considered one of the most secure and carefully managed corners of the institution. Every item carried a story. Every piece represented a chapter in the history of the crown. Errors happened from time to time, of course, but they were usually minor and quickly corrected. This felt different. Prince Edward knew it the moment he compared one inventory ledger against another and found details that simply did not add up. A bracelet connected to a previous generation of royals appeared in one record but not another. A ceremonial keepsake seemed to have vanished from its documented location. Then another discrepancy surfaced, and another. The deeper he looked, the more uneasy he became. Edward had spent years building a reputation as the quiet and dependable member of the family, someone who preferred responsibility over attention. He was not known for dramatic reactions, yet even he could not ignore what was beginning to emerge. What should have been a straightforward review was turning into something far more troubling. Questions were raised, explanations were requested, but instead of clarity, he encountered hesitation. Archive staff who normally answered questions without concern suddenly appeared uncomfortable. Conversations became shorter. Responses became vague. Some employees reportedly avoided discussing the missing items altogether. Others seemed nervous whenever certain names entered the conversation. It was as if an invisible wall had been erected around the issue, preventing anyone from speaking openly. That silence only intensified Edward's concern. Soon, instructions reportedly circulated among palace aides advising discretion. Nobody was to speculate. Nobody was to discuss inventory matters outside approved channels. On the surface, such caution could be explained as an effort to prevent rumors. But within royal residences, the unusual level of secrecy created the opposite effect. Whispers spread faster than facts. The absence of answers encouraged even more questions. Determined to separate truth from rumor, Edward quietly ordered a discreet internal verification process. He wanted every record checked and every discrepancy examined. No accusations were made, no conclusions were reached. But as information slowly returned to him, a pattern appeared to be forming. Several individuals connected to Camilla's wider circle seemed to appear repeatedly around decisions involving access, movement, and documentation. It was not evidence. It was not proof. Yet it was enough to spark concern among those who were following the matter closely. As days passed, tension quietly spread throughout royal residences. Staff members spoke in lowered voices. Senior aides monitored developments with growing anxiety. And behind the polished image of unity, a storm was beginning to gather. What started as a routine review was rapidly evolving into a mystery that threatened to reach far beyond missing objects, forcing Prince Edward toward a confrontation he never expected to face. But missing heirlooms were only the beginning, because the deeper Edward looked, the more disturbing the trail became. The missing items were not ordinary royal possessions. They were pieces of family history, artifacts connected to generations of monarchs whose stories shaped the crown itself. Their disappearance raised a terrifying question. How could objects protected for decades suddenly vanish without explanation? As Prince Edward's verification process continued, the true weight of the situation began to emerge. The missing heirlooms were not valuable simply because of their age or craftsmanship. Their significance ran far deeper. These were objects woven into the story of the monarchy itself, carrying connections to triumphs, sacrifices, and turning points that had defined generations of royal history. Some had reportedly passed through the hands of monarchs whose reigns transformed the nation. Others were believed to have held personal meaning for members of the family long after public ceremonies had ended. Together, they represented something far greater than material wealth. They were symbols of continuity, reminders that every generation inherited not only privilege but responsibility. That realization made their disappearance all the more disturbing. For decades, these treasures had existed under layers of protection, designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of mystery. Inventories were meticulously maintained. Access was carefully monitored. Records were preserved with extraordinary precision. Every movement was supposed to leave a trace. Every transfer required authorization. Every decision passed through established channels. The system had been built to ensure that history could never simply disappear. Yet somehow, despite all those safeguards, troubling gaps had emerged. The more Edward examined the records, the harder it became to dismiss the inconsistencies as harmless administrative errors. Certain heirlooms appeared in historical documentation, but could not be confirmed in current inventories. Some references seemed incomplete. Others appeared altered or missing altogether. What should have been straightforward verification increasingly felt like an effort to reconstruct a puzzle from pieces that no longer fit together. Each answer uncovered another question. Each discovery revealed another uncertainty. Among palace staff, unease continued to grow. Employees who had spent years working around royal collections found themselves questioning details they had once taken for granted. Conversations became filled with speculation. Quiet exchanges occurred behind closed doors. Individuals who rarely paid attention to archival matters suddenly wanted updates. The issue had evolved beyond a missing item investigation. It was becoming a matter of trust. Particularly troubling were emerging questions surrounding access permissions. Edward's review reportedly uncovered instances where authorization procedures may not have followed their usual patterns. Nothing conclusive had been established, but the timing was enough to draw attention. Why had certain permissions changed? Who had approved them? And perhaps most importantly, why were some of those changes connected to periods now attracting increased scrutiny? The answers remained frustratingly out of reach. As uncertainty spread, rumors moved even faster. Palace insiders whispered theories, ranging from innocent administrative mistakes to deliberate efforts to obscure information. Some believed the heirlooms had simply been relocated and poorly documented. Others feared something much more serious. The lack of transparency fueled every possibility. And with each passing day, the atmosphere surrounding the investigation became heavier. For Prince Edward, the situation was no longer merely concerning, it was becoming deeply personal. He understood what these heirlooms represented. They were not just possessions belonging to a royal household. They were pieces of a legacy entrusted to each generation. If something had compromised that legacy, he felt obligated to uncover the truth regardless of where it led. Yet even as his determination strengthened, so did a growing realization that the mystery might extend far beyond missing artifacts. Hidden beneath the discrepancies, delays, and unanswered questions appeared to be a pattern that someone had worked very hard to keep unnoticed. As concern turned into suspicion, attention began shifting toward a series of decisions that had quietly taken place months earlier. What unsettled investigators most was not what had disappeared, but who appeared connected to the changing records. The deeper officials dug into archived logs and access histories, the more often Camilla's name seemed to emerge in conversations nobody expected to have. By this point, the atmosphere surrounding the investigation had changed completely. What had started as a troubling inventory discrepancy was no longer being treated as a simple administrative problem. Too many questions remained unanswered. Too many unusual details had surfaced. And perhaps most unsettling of all, every new layer of examination seemed to bring investigators closer to the same uncomfortable destination. No one was making direct accusations, and no conclusions had officially been reached. But a pattern was beginning to form that senior figures inside the palace could no longer ignore. Prince Edward understood the danger of assumptions. He knew reputations could be damaged by rumors alone. That was precisely why he insisted on facts. Quietly and methodically, he continued reviewing access histories, authorization records, and archived correspondence connected to the missing heirlooms. The process was slow. Every detail had to be verified. Every inconsistency had to be examined. Yet the deeper he looked, the more difficult it became to dismiss what he was finding. Several records appeared to show procedural changes that had occurred months earlier. On paper, they seemed minor. A revised access protocol here, a modified approval process there. Individually, none of them appeared significant. Together, however, they painted a far more troubling picture. Long-standing inventory procedures that had remained unchanged for years had suddenly been adjusted. Certain safeguards appeared less rigid than before. Questions began emerging about who had requested those changes and why they had been approved so quietly. Those questions only intensified when staff members started recalling unusual instructions from previous months. Some remembered being told to prioritize discretion over documentation in specific situations. Others recalled requests that seemed strange at the time, but were now taking on a completely different meaning. Small details that had once felt insignificant suddenly appeared connected. Conversations that had been forgotten resurfaced. Decisions that seemed routine were being viewed through an entirely new lens. As whispers spread through royal residences, concern among senior royals steadily grew. The matter was no longer confined to archive personnel or administrative staff. Trusted advisors were being briefed. Private discussions were taking place behind closed doors. Individuals who rarely involved themselves in internal disputes were quietly monitoring developments. What frightened them was not merely the possibility that heirlooms had gone missing. It was the possibility that established systems of accountability had somehow been compromised along the way. Meanwhile, Prince Edward continued gathering information privately. He avoided public confrontations and resisted pressure to act prematurely. While rumors raced through palace corridors, he remained focused on evidence. Piece by piece, he assembled timelines. He reviewed approvals. He compared testimony against documentation. And with every passing day, his concern deepened. The mystery was no longer pointing toward a random mistake. It appeared connected to decisions made by people in positions of influence. Before long, invisible lines began forming inside the royal household. Some believed the investigation should remain quiet until every answer was secured. Others argued that the seriousness of the situation demanded immediate action. Loyalty, trust, and long-standing relationships suddenly became intertwined with questions of responsibility. Palace factions began emerging, not openly, but through subtle alliances and private conversations. Individuals found themselves choosing where they stood even before the truth had fully emerged. What made the situation even more explosive was the growing realization that someone, somewhere, seemed determined to keep certain answers hidden. Whether those efforts were intentional or merely the result of poor decisions remained unclear, but the effect was undeniable. Every attempt to uncover the truth appeared to reveal another layer of secrecy. Every resolved question uncovered two more. And as Prince Edward reviewed the growing collection of records, testimonies, and timelines before him, a chilling thought began to take shape. This mystery was far larger than anyone had imagined at the start. And when Edward finally assembled the evidence before him, he realized silence was no longer an option. For years, Prince Edward had earned a reputation as the quiet royal who avoided public conflict. But insiders claim that changed the moment he stepped into a private meeting with Camilla and demanded answers that nobody else had dared ask. The decision did not come easily. For weeks, Edward had resisted the temptation to act before every piece of information had been carefully examined. He understood the consequences of confrontation inside a royal household, already strained by competing loyalties and growing suspicion. Yet there comes a moment in every crisis when patience begins to resemble avoidance. And according to palace whispers, Edward had reached that point. The evidence he had assembled was far from complete, but it was substantial enough to convince him that difficult questions could no longer remain unspoken. A private audience was requested. No public announcement was made, No official explanation was offered, yet word spread quickly through royal circles that something significant was about to happen. Senior aides reportedly became aware of the meeting and understood its importance immediately. Some feared the discussion might finally bring clarity. Others worried it could deepen divisions already forming behind the scenes. Either way, everyone seemed to recognize that the stakes had suddenly become much higher. When the meeting began, years of quiet strength reportedly gave way to something far more direct. Edward was no longer approaching the matter as a routine review of records. He was confronting a mystery that threatened the integrity of royal history itself. One by one, the questions were raised. Missing heirlooms, altered procedures, unusual authorization requests, conflicting explanations. The issues that had accumulated over months were finally placed on the table together, forcing a conversation that many had hoped to avoid. According to those familiar with the aftermath, Camilla appeared surprised by the intensity of Edward's concerns. For so long, the investigation had remained largely hidden within administrative channels. Now it had reached the highest levels of the household. What may have once seemed like isolated questions had evolved into a coordinated effort to understand how such significant discrepancies had emerged in the first place. As the discussion continued, emotions reportedly intensified. This was no longer simply about missing artifacts. Beneath every question lay deeper concerns about trust, responsibility, and accountability. Long-standing tensions that had remained buried beneath years of royal protocol suddenly resurfaced. Old disagreements, competing priorities, quiet frustrations that had accumulated over time. The heirloom mystery had become a catalyst, exposing fault lines that extended far beyond archive records and inventory logs. What made the confrontation particularly explosive was the fact that neither side appeared willing to retreat. Edward believed he was protecting something sacred, a legacy entrusted to every generation of the royal family. Camilla, meanwhile, found herself facing questions that carried profound implications. The result was a meeting filled with pressure, uncertainty, and unresolved conflict. By the time it ended, few answers had been secured, but one reality had become impossible to ignore. The crisis was no longer contained. News of the confrontation spread rapidly through the household. Advisors whispered about it. Staff speculated about what had been said. Senior royals reportedly sought updates from trusted aides. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. Instead of calming concerns, the meeting seemed to amplify them. If anything, the lack of clear resolutions only strengthened the belief that far more remained hidden beneath the surface. For Prince Edward, that realization was particularly unsettling. He had entered the meeting hoping to bring clarity to a growing mystery. Instead, he left with an even stronger sense that the missing heirlooms represented only part of a much larger story. The answers he sought were still out there, concealed behind gaps in records, conflicting accounts, and decisions that nobody seemed eager to explain. And as new information slowly continued to emerge, it became increasingly clear that the confrontation had not ended the investigation. It had merely opened the door to an even deeper and more troubling chapter. Yet even that dramatic meeting failed to reveal the full truth, hidden beneath the surface. As the dispute intensified, King Charles found himself trapped between two people he trusted. One was his wife. The other was a brother known for loyalty and restraint. Choosing a side suddenly became impossible. The aftermath of Edward's confrontation with Camilla spread through the royal household far more quickly than anyone anticipated. What had begun as a private discussion was now influencing conversations at every level of the institution. Advisors exchanged concerns. Senior staff quietly compared accounts of what had taken place. Family members found themselves navigating an increasingly uncomfortable reality. The mystery surrounding the missing heirlooms was no longer an isolated issue buried inside archive records. It had evolved into a crisis capable of affecting relationships at the very heart of the monarchy. For King Charles, the situation was especially painful. Reports of the confrontation reached him at a moment when stability inside the family was already becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. He understood Edward's reputation better than anyone. His younger brother was not impulsive. He was not prone to unnecessary conflict. If Edward had chosen to raise such serious concerns directly, Charles knew there had to be a reason. Yet on the other side stood Camilla, the woman who had shared years of challenges, public scrutiny, and personal sacrifices alongside him. The king suddenly found himself standing between two people whose loyalty he had never previously questioned. As details of the dispute continued to circulate, divisions that had once remained hidden became more visible. Some individuals within royal circles believed Edward was simply fulfilling his duty by demanding answers. Others worried that allowing suspicion to grow unchecked could create lasting damage, regardless of what the investigation ultimately revealed. The uncertainty created tension in every direction. Even those who tried to remain neutral found themselves pulled into the growing debate. Senior advisors reportedly urged caution. They understood the sensitivity of the situation and the potential consequences of acting too quickly. The missing heirlooms represented one problem. Public confidence in the monarchy represented another. If mistakes had been made, they needed to be understood properly. If misunderstandings existed, they needed to be corrected before becoming permanent divisions. Yet the challenge was becoming more difficult with every passing day, because new questions continued to emerge faster than answers. Inside the palace, pressure steadily intensified. What had once been whispers in private corridors were now evolving into broader discussions about accountability. How could such important discrepancies remain unnoticed for so long? Were existing safeguards sufficient? Had established procedures been followed correctly? These questions extended beyond individual personalities. They touched the very systems responsible for protecting royal history and preserving public trust. That reality made the issue impossible to dismiss. Meanwhile, Edward showed no signs of retreating. The confrontation with Camilla had not weakened his resolve. If anything, it had strengthened it. He remained convinced that the truth had yet to be uncovered, and that stopping the investigation prematurely would only deepen the mystery. His determination earned admiration from some and concern from others, but it ensured that the matter would not simply disappear through silence or delay. Recognizing the growing stakes, Charles reportedly sought additional verification. He wanted facts, not assumptions. He wanted certainty, not speculation. More records were reviewed. Additional information was requested. Trusted advisors were tasked with examining details independently. The king hoped that a clearer picture would emerge before the divisions widened further. Yet, as fresh reports arrived, they seemed to create more questions than solutions. What troubled Charles most was the growing sense that every answer uncovered another hidden layer. The investigation no longer resembled a straightforward search for missing heirlooms. It was becoming a journey into decisions, permissions, and actions that stretched back months. Somewhere within that complicated trail, a crucial piece of the puzzle remained concealed. And while the palace struggled to maintain calm, forces already set in motion were moving toward a revelation that nobody could predict. But the investigation was about to uncover a discovery that would change everything. Just when officials believed they had reached the end of the mystery, a new discovery emerged from inside the archives. What it revealed transformed a troubling inventory issue into a full-scale royal crisis. For weeks, investigators had followed the same trail of inconsistencies, hoping that eventually the missing pieces would align and provide a clear explanation. Instead, the opposite happened. The closer they came to resolving the mystery, the more complicated it became. Then came the breakthrough that changed everything. Buried among archived records and overlooked documentation was information that had not been included in earlier reviews. At first glance, it appeared insignificant. But as specialists examined it more closely, they realized it connected multiple unanswered questions that had haunted the investigation from the very beginning. The discovery sent an immediate wave of concern through those overseeing the inquiry. What had once seemed like isolated discrepancies suddenly appeared linked. Records that previously looked unrelated now pointed toward a broader pattern. Inventory gaps that had been dismissed as separate incidents seemed connected by common threads. The implications were deeply unsettling. Rather than reducing uncertainty, the new evidence suggested the situation might be far more extensive than anyone had imagined. As investigators expanded their review, additional discrepancies began surfacing. One inconsistency led to another, then another. Items that had never previously raised concern were re-examined. Historical records were compared against current inventories with greater scrutiny. The deeper officials looked, the more questions emerged. What had started as a search for a handful of missing heirlooms was evolving into a wider examination of procedures, permissions, and accountability. The growing scale of the issue forced investigators to widen the circle of inquiry. Additional staff members were questioned. Employees who had once considered themselves distant from the matter suddenly found themselves revisiting decisions, approvals, and conversations from months earlier. Some provided helpful context. Others struggled to explain details that had seemed routine at the time. Every interview added another layer to the mystery. Every answer revealed fresh uncertainties. Concern soon spread beyond archive departments and administrative offices. Palace security teams reportedly launched reviews of their own. Existing safeguards were reassessed. Access histories received renewed scrutiny. Procedures once considered reliable were examined with new urgency. The possibility that significant discrepancies could exist within protected systems was alarming enough. The possibility that they had remained unnoticed for so long was even more troubling. Meanwhile, confidential updates began reaching senior members of the royal family. What they learned reportedly heightened concerns rather than easing them. The investigation was no longer dealing with a narrow administrative problem. It was confronting questions capable of affecting the credibility of long-standing royal institutions. The stakes had changed dramatically. This was no longer merely about recovering missing heirlooms. It was about understanding how the situation had been allowed to develop in the first place. As the seriousness of the discovery became clearer, a new fear emerged inside the palace. What if the story became public before the investigation reached its conclusions? The prospect of public exposure weighed heavily on advisors and officials alike. Rumors were already circulating. Speculation was growing. If details escaped before answers were secured, the resulting fallout could be impossible to control. Amid that growing uncertainty, Prince Edward found his position strengthened. Those who had once questioned the scope of his concerns now recognized that his warnings had not been exaggerated. His insistence on pursuing the truth had uncovered information that might otherwise have remained hidden indefinitely. Support for continuing the investigation increased, and with it came renewed determination to uncover every remaining piece of the puzzle. Yet perhaps the most unsettling realization was that the mystery still was not fully solved. The new discovery had explained some questions, but it had raised others that were even more disturbing. Hidden beneath the records, interviews, and security reviews appeared to be a deeper truth waiting to emerge. And as pressure mounted from every direction, the monarchy found itself approaching a moment from which there would be no easy retreat. And with the facts becoming harder to ignore, the crown faced a decision that could not be delayed. The era of quiet discussions was over. Behind closed doors, senior royals began taking action, implementing measures designed to protect royal assets and restore confidence in an institution suddenly under scrutiny. The discovery that had shaken the investigation left the palace with little room for hesitation. For months, uncertainty had allowed the mystery to grow unchecked. Questions had multiplied faster than answers, and speculation had spread through royal circles like a gathering storm. Now, however, the atmosphere was changing. The focus was no longer on simply understanding what had happened. The focus had shifted toward preventing further damage and restoring confidence in systems that many believed had been compromised. A decisive response was no longer optional. It had become necessary. Emergency reviews were reportedly launched across multiple departments connected to royal collections and archival management. Officials revisited procedures that had remained unchanged for years. Safeguards once viewed as dependable were suddenly being tested under intense scrutiny. Every process was examined with a single goal in mind, ensuring that no similar questions could emerge again. The speed of these actions reflected the seriousness of the situation. What had begun as a missing heirloom investigation had evolved into something capable of affecting the credibility of the institution itself. One of the first areas to receive attention involved access privileges. Existing permissions were reassessed. Long-standing arrangements were reviewed. Individuals who previously enjoyed broad levels of access reportedly found themselves subject to new oversight. The changes were not presented as accusations. Instead, they were framed as precautionary measures designed to strengthen accountability. Yet within the palace, few failed to recognize the significance of what was happening. The rules were changing, and they were changing because trust had been shaken. Alongside these reviews came the introduction of new oversight procedures. Layers of verification were strengthened. Documentation requirements became more rigorous. Approvals that once passed through routine channels now faced additional examination. These measures reflected a growing determination among senior figures to ensure that every decision involving royal assets could be traced and explained. The era of assumptions was ending. In its place came a demand for transparency that many had not anticipated. Throughout this period, Prince Edward increasingly emerged as one of the leading voices behind the effort. The same persistence that had driven him to investigate the missing heirlooms now positioned him at the center of the palace response. Individuals who had once viewed his concerns cautiously were beginning to acknowledge that his determination had exposed problems requiring immediate attention. His role transformed from investigator to advocate for reform, and his influence grew accordingly. King Charles, meanwhile, faced one of the most delicate challenges of his reign. The reforms carried significant implications, both personally and institutionally. Yet the growing weight of evidence left little alternative. Reports suggest that he authorized a series of internal changes designed to strengthen accountability and restore confidence. It was not an easy decision. Every action carried consequences. Every reform risked intensifying tensions already present within the household. But inaction was becoming an even greater risk. For Camilla, the pressure became increasingly difficult to ignore. The investigation, the confrontation, and the reforms had combined to place her under an uncomfortable spotlight. Whether fair or unfair, questions continued to surround the circumstances that had brought the palace to this point. The scrutiny grew heavier with each new development, and the controversy showed no signs of fading. At the same time, concerns about public perception intensified. Advisors understood that the monarchy's strength depended not only on tradition, but also on trust. If confidence eroded, the consequences could extend far beyond a single investigation. Protecting that trust became a priority equal to uncovering the truth itself. Yet beneath the policy changes, security reviews, and administrative reforms, a larger struggle was beginning to emerge, one that would force the royal family to confront fundamental questions about leadership, legacy, and the direction of the institution for years to come. But beyond the policies and procedures lay a deeper battle, one that concerned the future of the monarchy itself. In the end, the missing heirlooms became about far more than objects locked inside royal vaults. They exposed a struggle over trust, duty, and the very meaning of royal responsibility, a struggle that may shape the monarchy for years to come. As the dust slowly began to settle, many inside the royal household realized that the investigation had transformed into something much larger than anyone could have imagined at the start. The missing heirlooms had been the spark, but the fire they ignited reached into questions that touched the very foundation of the institution. What began as a search for missing artifacts became a test of accountability, loyalty, and leadership. It forced the monarchy to confront uncomfortable realities about how power is exercised, how trust is maintained, and what happens when long-established systems are suddenly called into question. Throughout the crisis, Prince Edward emerged as an unlikely central figure. For years, he had worked quietly in the background, rarely attracting the attention that followed other members of the royal family. Yet when uncertainty threatened the integrity of royal heritage, he stepped forward with remarkable determination. He refused to accept easy explanations. He resisted pressure to move on before answers were found. While others worried about the consequences of asking difficult questions, Edward remained focused on protecting something he believed belonged not just to the family, but to history itself. His actions revealed a side of him that many had underestimated, a steadfast guardian willing to endure criticism and tension in pursuit of the truth. At the same time, King Charles faced one of the most delicate balancing acts of his reign. Every decision carried personal and institutional consequences. Supporting the investigation risked deepening divisions within the household. Ignoring it risked damaging public confidence. The king found himself navigating a path between competing loyalties, trying to preserve unity while ensuring accountability. It was a difficult burden, one that highlighted the challenges of leadership when private relationships and public responsibilities collide. For Camilla, the controversy left lasting questions. Regardless of where the investigation ultimately led, the scrutiny surrounding her role became impossible to ignore. The pressure, the speculation, and the growing public interest placed her in an increasingly difficult position. Fairly or unfairly, her name had become linked to one of the most troubling royal mysteries in recent memory. That reality ensured that the effects of the controversy would not disappear overnight. Perhaps the most important lesson to emerge from the crisis was the realization that institutions survive only when they are willing to examine themselves honestly. The investigation demonstrated that tradition alone cannot protect trust. Accountability must accompany authority. Transparency must support responsibility. Without those principles, even the strongest institutions become vulnerable to doubt. As a result, renewed attention was placed on oversight, record-keeping, and internal safeguards. The reforms introduced during the crisis were not simply reactions to a single event. They represented a broader commitment to ensuring that future generations would inherit an institution capable of protecting its history while adapting to modern expectations. In many ways, the monarchy entered a new chapter shaped by the lessons of this difficult period. Yet despite the reviews, the reforms, and the countless hours devoted to uncovering answers, some mysteries remain stubbornly resistant to complete resolution. The heirlooms themselves may one day be fully accounted for. The records may eventually be reconciled. But the deeper questions uncovered during the investigation will continue to echo through royal corridors long after the headlines fade. Questions about trust, questions about responsibility, questions about the delicate balance between loyalty and accountability. Because while the heirlooms may eventually be accounted for, the questions raised by their disappearance may never fully disappear. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.